In this video, I'm going to show you how you can create a custom palette in Pinta. Now before I actually get started with creating a custom palette, let's take a look at my webpage. And if you found this video on YouTube, I will provide a link below the video in the description area where you can go to this webpage that will show you the step-by-step instructions for setting up your custom color palette. But before we actually get into creating a color palette, in my last video of Pinta, I did go through all the commands or features within the edit menu. Now you can see palette is on the very bottom, which palette is not a command in itself, it's a submenu. And when you go out to the submenu or look at the features or commands within the submenu, you have the command of open, where you can open up an existing or a custom color palette, and that's what I'm going to show you how, so that you can open it. You can save a color palette, you can restore back to the default, or you can set the number of colors in your color palette. By default, your color palette has 48 colors. There's 16 colors and there's 3 rows, so that's a total of 48 colors. And this right here is the default color palette. That's what the default color palette looks like. Now the individual little squares are called swatches. You know, if you were to go to a store and look at samples of paint, they refer to those as swatches. And the same thing within the color palette. The individual colors are referred to as swatches. Now, before we get started, when we start to create a color palette or a customized color palette, you're going to be looking at a dialog box similar to this, and I'll show you in just a moment. Now, there are some terms that you kind of need to be familiar with, especially if you're reading across other websites and you run across words like hue, saturation, value. Now the word hue, and I have these terms on my webpage that you can use as a reference, but hue is another name for color, like red, yellow, green, blue. For the selected color that you have selected, it's expressed as a value between 0 and 360. Now the hue for the current color that I have selected is the hue value of 334. Now it cannot go any higher than 360. Remember the color wheel that you learned? It actually works similar to that wheel. Here's like your starting point. Any place could be your starting point. It just happens to be that's the color at that location. But if you're spinning around, you can only go back to 360 degrees and you're back at the original location. So you can go as small as 0 up to 360 to represent a hue. Now saturation is the strength or purity of a color expressed as a value between 0 and 100. So I can reduce the saturation to 0 and I can increase it to 100. So it has a saturation of 100. It says as the saturation increases, the color appears to be more pure, 100%. So as you decrease that value, the colors will appear to be washed out. Now the value itself. It says value refers to the lightness or the darkness of a color. It's expressed between 0 and 100. So since it's in the halfway point, if you increase the value, then you're increasing the value, the lightness. If you decrease it, you make it darker. Now those are pretty self-explanatory. The numbers, eventually you'll learn what those means with red, green, and blue. Now opacity, it's at its maximum of 255. The range is between 0 and 255. If you go all the way down to 0, the color becomes completely transparent. So if you save an image of PNG, that color will be transparent where that's at. So when you're using the tool to erase, you're erasing colors, but what you're doing is actually you're making that color transparent. Leaving it at 255 leaves it at full color. If you reduce it, it starts to make the color semi-transparent. Alright, here, like I said, is your color wheel. This is the color that you're actually working with, and this is eyedropper. So when you click on the eyedropper, that's the eyedropper. That's where you select the color within your image. Now this is right here's the point we're going to focus on. When we're creating a new color palette, we're going to be looking at its hex value. The hex value is the number in hexadecimal or hex numbering system that represents the color within your system. Now if you want more information about hex colors, I do have 2 websites that does a wonderful job on explaining hex value up with colors. This is called the HTML CSS color picker, and as you can see here, it has a hex value of 93C54B, and that color is green. Now you can change this number value and it will pick the color, or you can choose the random button. and it will randomly generate a color for you, and it tells you what its hex value is, which in this case is turquoise. Another that you can study the hex value of colors is called color rate. Now, once you click on color rate, it goes through and tells you, you can it says try your favorite color. So if I click here, it's going to change it to red. And if you read a little bit more in the information, it will tell you how it comes about. It's called bright red. So these are two great websites for understanding the hex values of color. Now, again, if you find this on YouTube, I will go through and explain how to create a custom color palette. I go through step-by-step illustrated instructions all the way down until you actually get your new color palette. So if you look here at the bottom, I completely erased all the purples and replaced them with browns. Now you don't have to just do one row. You can change all of these according to the image that you're working with. Now, one reason why you want to create a custom color palette is if you're working with an image, and let me show you. Let's say that I'm working with this image here. Now, across the bottom here, we have a lot of purples and pinks and light pinks. We do have some pinks that are appearing over here, but if I'm not planning on editing or changing those colors, I may want to create more of the color areas that I'm going to be working with. And I don't have to just replace the pinks. I can come in here, since there's very little green other than the green in the trees, I could replace the greens in that area with the colors, say the browns from the mountains. But in this case, to stay with the video, I'm going to select the very bottom one, which is the dark purple or burgundy. It's actually a dark pink or burgundy color. Now, before I actually go and make any changes, let me go back to the black and make this. This is my primary swatch. This is my secondary swatch. And the primary color box or swatch is the color that's active when I'm painting or typing on the image. But before we go any further, let's go to the menu, Edit, Palette. And if I click Open, I do have a folder in my documents. If I go Documents, Pinta, Palettes, now this is a folder that I created. There's nothing in it at the moment. Now, when we do save or open files, we can open a TXT extension, which is the paint.net extension, or we can open the GPL, which is the GIMP extension. I currently have nothing in this folder to open. So before we go any further, we want to save our default color palette. So as we're making changes to it, we won't overwrite the default. Now, there's a way to go back and restore the default. We can go Palette. If we mess it up and click Restore Default, and it will set it back to its default settings. But in this case, to be on the 100% safe side, I'm going to go to my Documents, Pinta, Palettes, and I'm going to call this Default. DEFAULT.txt. I'm giving it the TXT extension because if you look down here in the lower right-hand corner, it's a paint.net palette, the extension that works for paint.net. As you know, that Pinta derived from the paint.net program that works in Windows. Pinta is just the Linux version of paint.net. And then when I say it's the actual Linux version, it's not exactly a copycat. There are some features of paint.net that is not within Pinta and vice versa. Now, you can also save it to the GIMP palette. So if you're using GIMP, you can use the palette that you created here and open it within GIMP. I'm going to leave it as the TXT extension. So when I hit the Save button, now if you don't have these folders, you can say Create a Folder. When it does, it will pop up. You choose the location, type the name, and it will create that folder for you. So I went ahead and pre-did that before this video. So when I save this, it's now created a folder, a file by the name as default. So when I hit open and I go to my documents, I go to Pinta, I go to palettes, there is the default. So if I mess up this default right here, now I don't want to change that value default, because if I go back to open it, it's going to open with the changes here. So let me cancel. Now let's go back to the original color that I selected, which is the dark purple, or in this case the dark pink or the burgundy. Now when I click onto the primary color, it will bring up a Choose Primary Color dialog box. This is the hue, this is the saturation, and this is the value that we want to replace, which is that color here. Now, here's the color as an example, and there is the color name. Now, before I actually click on the eyedropper and select to replace that color, I need to know what value we are replacing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my accessories, and I'm going to open up my text editor. Now, in the text editor that I'm using is not Pluma, it's gedit. Now you can use any text editor that you have installed on your system. Now I'm going to copy this color and I'm going to place it here on my clipboard. Now I'm going to move down a few spaces to allow me room for additional colors. Now before I go and select a different color, let me go back and show you something. If I go back to this color scheme here, where I can type that value here, I can take this value right here with the numbers, and I'm going to replace the numbers here, and I'm going to hit paste, and when I hit search, it's going to find that value. There it is. That's the color that is within my Pinta program that I'm replacing. So it can tell you a little description. See, it's a deep pink. It gives you the RGB, the red, green, blue values. The red is 127, the green is 0, and the blue is 55. So if you come back into here, the red, green, blue, 127, 0, 55, 127, 0, 55. So it will give you the information within your Pinta program because this is the information for that hex value, and it will give you a much better detailed version of what hex values is compared to what I'm doing in this video and on my website. Now up here you can search for it. You can type it in a search box here, but let me show you where I copied that color on my clipboard. I can paste it here, press the enter key, and it will automatically go to that color. Notice the background is that color. The little large swatch which we have here. Now you can download the swatches and save them on your computer like a little folder where you have swatches of color in real life where you're comparing things. But since you have this web page, I really don't see any need. Now you can see here, whereas that web page calls it deep pink, this web page calls it burgundy. And that's the way that we identify names. A lot of times we have more than one name for a particular color. Now let's get back to the program. I put that color on my clipboard, and you're going to see why in a few moments. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my eyedropper, but before I do, if the color I want to select is behind the dialog box, I must move my dialog box first, because once I choose the eyedropper, my mouse pointer or cursor will change to the eyedropper icon, meaning that I can't click on the dialog box and drag it away, because if I click here, it will pick the color of the title bar, or if I click somewhere in the box, it'll pick the gray area. It selects the color. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of the dark browns in the mountain area on the left. So I'm going to click on the color or the eyedropper, and when I do, notice the eyedropper icon is now replaced my mouse pointer or my mouse cursor. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose one of the dark browns. Now there's the dark brown. You've seen that was a whole purple bar or burgundy bar, and now the dark brown has replaced it on the right hand side. Now it hasn't replaced it over here yet in the primary color because I haven't hit OK. But this is the color I want to replace in my color palette. So I'm going to open up my text, my notepad, in this case my Gedit text editor, and this is the color that I want to replace that color. Now keep that in mind. Now when I hit OK, it replaces the burgundy up here with the dark brown, but it didn't replace it here. Now before I go and replace this value down here on the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and choose this color. I'm going to come up here and click on to the primary color. This is my second color that I want to replace. I can keep going through here and do them all. So that's the top color I want to replace, and the bottom color is the one I'm going to replace it with. This is my second color that I want to replace, and I'm going to choose a lighter brown this time because I chose a dark area right in here. I'm going to choose a lighter brown, maybe right along in here for the next brown color. So I'm going to choose the eyedropper. I'm going to come in here where it's a lighter brown, and I click it. Notice this brown is a little brighter because a while ago the circle was up here indicating that it was darker. Now it's a little bit lighter brown. So I'm going to select the color of brown. I'm going to copy, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to paste this in underneath that. This is my original color. That's the color I'm going to replace. This is my original color. There's the color I'm going to replace. So I'm going to come down a few. Now the last thing I'm going to do is the last color on the color palette, which is the bottom. And I'm going to hit OK first, and that changes to the lighter brown. Now I'm going to click on the light pink. Up here in the primary color, I click this. This is the color I want to replace. I come and put it in my text editor, which is my Gedit text editor. I come down a few spaces. Now I want to choose my eyedropper for the color I'm going to replace. In this case, I want one of the lighter browns, which is here. There was the dark brown, there was the lighter mid brown, and this is the light brown. So when I click here, notice it's much lighter than this one and even the darker one. So this is my light brown that I want to replace the light pink with. I put this in my text editor. Alright, now I click on OK, and it only replaced the medium brown with the light brown here. It hasn't really done anything yet with this particular color palette. It's still at the default. Remember, I got to go into my Documents, Pinta, Palettes, and I want to right click the default that I saved. I will right click, and I can open with Pluma, which is the default, but in this case, since I saved it with originally with my Gedit, and I do have the instructions for installing that on my website if you'd like to install Gedit. Now I have two text editors open. This one is the default color, the hexadecimal format. These are all the colors in your default color palette. Here's the unsaved document. This is the colors that I want to find. Now notice I'm going to select all the color but the hash mark. I'm going to say copy, right click, copy. I'm going to search for that color here. Now, one thing all of these colors have in common is they all contain FF at the beginning. I will not replace the FF at the beginning of each of these. Now, you don't want to go and hit the Save button or any of these other buttons and close it out. You want to hit the hamburger menu. There's two features up here that will work, the Find feature and the Find and Replace. Since we will be replacing the original color, it's best to use the Find and Replace. You can get by with the Find. It'll locate it, but then you have to manually come in there and replace it with the value from the clipboard. So I'm going to hit Find and Replace. Here's the color I want to find. Now let me go back and get the color I want to replace it with. So I come here and I put the color I want to replace it with. So now the first thing I want to do is I want to execute the Find feature, and when it finds it, I'm going to automatically choose Replace. So let's find that color. There's the original color, which was the burgundy. I'm going to replace it with the dark brown. Hit Replace. I have replaced it now. The 24181A is the replacement for the burgundy color. So I'm going to come in here. I've replaced the dark burgundy. Now I'm going to replace the medium burgundy. It's kind of a little bit darker pink, but between it. There's the value I want to find. Here's the value I'm going to replace it with. Now I got to make sure that I get all the numbers and alphabets, not including the hash mark, which is the pound sign in front of those numbers. Now I come in here and replace this number. If you forget to replace it, you're going to have two of the same colors on your color palette. The next thing I want to do, when I put both colors, the color I want to locate, the color I'm going to replace it with, I hit the Find feature. When it finds the FF006E, I'm going to say replace it with the 5B3E38. So hit Replace. The last thing I'm doing is, because I'm only replacing 3 colors, is to select the color I'm looking for, go back into here, replace it within the Find, and then I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to select the bottom color minus the hash mark or pound sign, go back to my default, and then I paste that in here. So when I hit the Find button, it's going to find the original color and replace it with my new color. So hit Find. There it is, the FF7FB6. Now I want to replace it with, and it replaced it with 805A4D. Now I'm ready to close. Now this is very, very important what I'm fixing to say. Do not click on the Save button, and let me explain why. If you click on the Save button, you will accidentally save the default colors. You do not want to make this right here your new default colors. You want to give this palette a whole new name. So to rename this palette, you're not going to click the Save button. Stay away from that. Click the hamburger menu, or if you're using a different text editor, go to where you find the Save As command. Now, anytime you see a command that has ... that just simply means it's going to bring up an extra dialog box, whereas the I hit Find and Replace brought up a dialog box. The Find feature will bring up a dialog box. So I'm going to click as the Save As. It brings up a dialog box. I do not want to save the new color palette with default. I don't want that as my default. So if I come here, I can give it like Mountain, and I'll do a dash colors. I could call it anything, but I'm going to call it Mountain Colors. And I'm going to save it in the same folder in Documents, Pinta, Palettes folder that I created, that I stored my default. I hit save. And when I do, it is now saved in that folder. I'm going to minimize this just in case I need it, and when I realize I don't need it anymore, I can close out without saving either of these two documents in my gedit text editor. Now you can look up here where it once on this tab called default.txt, it now says mountain-colors.txt, and you can see it up here in the tab. Mountain-colors, and it tells you the location in the Documents Pinta Palettes folder. Now you can put it in whatever folder that you want and can you remember on your system. Now we still haven't changed this color palette yet. However, we have created a new color palette. We can go Edit, Palette, Open. Now it's currently on, and it's currently in the Recently Used, so I can go to Documents, I can go to Pinta, I can go to palettes, and I only have two color palettes so far. My default palette, which you see here, and my mountains colors, where I replaced the last three colors on my original color palette. So when I select the new color palette and I hit open, look at the bottom. In place of a burgundy, which is a dark pink, a mid pink, and a light pink, I now have a dark brown, a medium brown, and a light brown. So I could use these same steps going through, and I could create myself a whole new color palette. I could add colors or remove colors depending on the features within here. I could reset back to the default. So if I go back and reset, it's now back to the original default colors in the color palette. Or I can go back, and where this comes in handy is if let's say for example I'm editing this image, and if I want to spend a lot of time editing this image, I may use a color palette that has the colors of the color in this image, and then I can load it and keep using it as long as I'm using or editing that image. So when I go to mountain colors, and you want to name your color palette something that you can remember, especially if you're starting to create a whole list of color palettes. And sometimes if you're creating a large list of color palettes and you're not using them, and rather than deleting them, you might want to use them to a folder or restoring them on a thumb drive so that you can later retrieve them without having a large list here. Now when I hit open, notice the color palette, because I reset it back to the default, it now changes back to our custom color palette. Now let me show you something that I didn't realize this in my last video when I was going through and went through the features of the edit menu. If I were to close this, let's go up here and say File, Quit. Now it didn't prompt me, do I want to save? Because I really didn't do anything with the image. The only thing I did was I created me a new color palette, and it didn't ask me, did I want to go and save that? If I go to my edit menu, there's the only image that I have here. If I say open with Pinta, now before I actually click on Pinta, remember the default color at the very bottom was burgundy all the way to light pink. When I open up Pinta and I go like to view best fit, and I didn't have to do that, look down here at the bottom. It will not open up your default color palette. It will open up the last color palette that you worked with, that you had open. So it kind of remembers, it saves the settings when you open it. So if you would like to restore your color palette, you could go back to Edit, and instead of hitting Open and going to the dialog box, you could just say Reset to the default, and it's now back to your default. So if I wasn't working with this image, I was working with another image, then I could go back and say Reset Default. It puts it back at my default so that I can create a color palette for the image that I'm working on. Or let's say that I want to now take these different shades or colors of blue. So I have blues here, but not exactly these color blues. So I could simply come down here on the pinks or in the yellows or greens areas and click on those just like I did. I could go back first and open this one up. And when I open up and I could open it from my recent, that works as well, because I just recently got an update and had to reinstall my driver. So that's a recent file that I opened. But in this case, I want to open Mountain Colors. It makes the browns here. Now, if I go back and start changing these to green, unlike while ago when I said Save As, when you're in your text editor and you change colors, when you got the color like Mountains Reflections, when you can then hit the Save button, as long as you're going to save the changes to the current open color palette, which is your custom color palette. The only time you really need to hit Save As is if you're going to create a whole new color palette, or not saving it as the default color palette. If you're adding to your color palette, you can just hit the Save button. So on my website, if you're using this as reference material, as you scroll down, I will remind you when you get to that point to where you're saving it. Like here's where you found and replaced, and that's the value that I replaced. When you get ready to save it, I told you, important, do not click on the Save button if you do it or change the color palette as the default text file. What you do is you click on the Save As, and then it brings up the dialog box, and I explain why the importance of giving it a new name. Hopefully, this has helped you. I know I'll only change 3 colors within your color palette, but understanding how to change those 3 colors, you can go through here and do all 48 colors to where you have your custom palette. You can then save your custom palette with the Save As command, and you can save as many custom palettes as you have hard drive space on your computer. But like I said, if you're saving them in the same folder for your custom palette, sometimes it can become very difficult locating a custom palette according to the image you want to use. So when you're naming them, use a name that's easy to remember that you can associate with the image that you're using or that you're trying to edit. Hopefully this video has helped you understand how to create a custom palette within Pinta, and have a great day.